The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.
Hey everyone, welcome again to the Integration Podcast, joined by Robb Smith and Nick Hedlund, picking up the first of our sort of podcast deep dives into what's already hopefully been seen in terms of the recording of the IM Research Forum, in which we laid out the vision for this really cool effort to bring together integrative metatheories and synthesize, compare, contrast, and integrate across a number of big picture models in the lead up to a big symposium that we'll be doing in the fall, bringing together the scholars in our integration society. And in a big effort to move the ball forward in these integrative frameworks. So this is an opportunity to sort of unpack some things that maybe were broached or raised briefly in that presentation, but also to do a deeper dive into some of the key ideas, and generally just sort of bring up and explore other aspects of this effort that weren't necessarily surfaced there. So yeah, why don't you guys introduce yourselves? I'll just say first, Brendan Graham Dempsey, and I'm doing the managing editor for the Integration Journal, also director of research, and helping these wonderful people with the efforts that we're doing at IM. But Rob and Nick, go ahead and say your piece.
Yeah, so I'm Robb Smith, one of the founders of the Institute of Applied Metatheory, and currently CEO, and also supporting the team on the various efforts that we have underway in what we think of as one of our main vectors of research, which is the development and kind of underlaboring and philosophy building for the next generation of integrative metatheory.
Right on. I'm Nick Hedlund. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Integration Journal and also the director of research at IM. And yeah, I'm excited to just dive in here and talk about some of the key issues here. We laid out this vision we've been working towards actualizing. We really wanted to bring together what we feel like are the kind of leading edge integrative metatheories. And this is a process that got started a long time ago, really. Sean Esbjörn-Hargens, an amazing leader in the integrative space, some years back, he was the chair of the Integral Theory Conference back in 2010, 2013, and he really invited us to kind of go meta on the integral framework. And so he has this whole notion of meta integral. And he brought in critical realism and Edgar Morin's complex thought, and invited us to consider these as kind of parallel integral frameworks that were in every way as powerful as Wilber's integral theory, and really start to consider this ecology of integrals rather than just this singular integral. And since then, we've really been following this thread of like, how do these different approaches inform each other? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their internal contradictions? And what happens when we bring them into dialogue? How can we cross-pollinate them? And most importantly, what is the vision of reality that starts to emerge when we move beyond any identification with any one of them? We start to refract reality through each of these lenses, and slowly we start to come into a more what we might call an alethic view of reality. And that process has just continued. The liminal web developed, and a lot of the integral adjacent kind of spaces opened up, and we saw that there are a lot of other important voices that we weren't even really on the radar back in the day. Greg Heinriches's UTalk, Jason Storm's metamodernism, Hansi Franak's metamodern approach, and many, many others. And so we've just been trying to, in a sense, continue to follow that golden thread that started back in the day, and to really try and see what opens up in our view of reality as we do this. And all of that is kind of geared at how do we come into a deeper understanding of reality? How do we come into a more resonant understanding of reality, so that we can act in the right way in the world, so that we can alleviate the suffering, so that we can create a more sustainable and just and flourishing world. And so that's kind of the big picture of what we're up to. So I'll leave it at that and let you guys jump in.
Well, I'd throw in the question here. So I've been glad to see some engagement so far. We're putting these out. People are noticing what we're up to, and are engaging and interested. And there's also kind of some predictable, you could call them critiques or concerns. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about this. That this sort of like, oh, this is just more thinking, more modeling, more ideas. You already gestured to it briefly, Nick, there in terms of getting into sort of alethic deepening with reality. But I think that's a good place to start for some of this. Is like, what's, so what, right? Is it just having some big master new model that we can use to what, to what end? So I think maybe, yeah, talking a little bit about that could be helpful for people, so that the stakes are kind of considered, and the kind of goals are kind of outlined there. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, both of you.
Yeah, I think this is a common refrain that misunderstands the role in which all of our meaning making is always already sort of prefigured by some form of world view, some sort of theory or meta theory about the world, and that structures how we think about it. That structures how we act. It structures how what we value, what we can see. And so if the old, adage about there's nothing as practical as a good theory, is true, and I think it is, then there's something even more true about the 21st century, when we have global kind of cooperation issues that are very obvious to everybody. We have global cross-border, cross-value systems, cross-nationalities, cross, right? Cross-disciplinary things that are actually real in the real world. AI, biological threats, climate change, and things happening in the ecology. We're about to see Starlink launched, right? Starlink as an IPO. Okay, so we have the colonization of low Earth orbit, right? That's not something that just has ramifications for India or an American or European or somebody in Peru. It's our commons in space, and yet we don't even have a grammar that's adequate to talk about that happening. And so across all these different areas, and maybe I mentioned AI or not, if I didn't, AI, right? So all of these things are happening and they're real. So if there's nothing as practical as a good theory, there's nothing as essential as actually an integrative meta theory, because an integrative meta theory is what begins to take you beyond the fractured and fragmented and siloed knowledge of either various disciplines or various cultures or various traditions or various whatever, and begins to just ask questions about how can we have a more planetary knowledge system? How can we have a more planetary, integrated, civilizational scope way of making sense with each other and across all of our differences? So, the map is not the territory. It's a very sort of common thing for people to say, but the other corollary to it is that without a map, you're lost in the territory. And the reality is that the postmodern critique was sufficient or necessary, but not sufficient. And it kind of diagnosed without prescribing. So we've been left in the early 21st century without a knowledge system and without even kind of an ethic towards integration in our knowledge production, what Jürgen Wren calls a system of knowledge that yearns towards the planetary, yearns towards the integrative. And that's actually essential right now, because without a good map, we are truly going to be lost in the territory. So to me, and I think for those of us in this area, it seems both obvious and essential, but like I get the critique, but I really think people should take on board what's happening and then say to themselves, okay, then what rationally must be the shape of the kind of solutions that we pursue to begin to integrate across different, these differences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think that's very well said. And I mean, I think if you look back in history and you can identify some of these major cultural changes, these sort of phase transitions in cultural epochs, you know, we often talk about that in terms of sort of pre-modern, modern, postmodern, integrative, or other ways of framing that. But there are these really structural level systemic shifts that have occurred across human history that have been part of this overarching process of um, moving to greater complexification, but also changes in our technological landscape, and then how we see all of that and how we make sense of all that. Sort of a full quadrant, sort of individuals and collectives where systems are informing how people are seeing the world and how the worldviews are shifting. This is kind of the framework. And so in that sense, right, I mean, you see these moments where modernity starts to kind of get its footing, and a lot of that arguably is coming from some of the pioneering work that some thinkers are doing in places like the Royal Society, and these sorts of hotbeds of sort of conceptual and scientific sort of development that get underway, that are all just little dots on the map, but that start to accrue over time and really start to influence the way that people across the world eventually wind up not just seeing the world, but also the world that they wind up inhabiting. You can make a kind of similar case for what then happens in the later 20th century and how the postmodern critiques of the modern do something similar within academia and institutions of knowledge, that there's kind of a whole scale structural reorganization about thinking about ideologies and systems and all of these things. And that has a certain
Power.
trajectory. Yeah, power, certainly. It has a certain trajectory to it. And I mean, it seems like right now, arguably, uh, we're in a similar kind of position. And it seems to make sense that what is the next movement along that kind of arc? What's still being left out of our picture? And in the year 2026, what is sort of the next phase of that, in a way that can make the cultural changes and the worldview shifts and the technological shifts more tractable, bringing things out of our blind spots, and present new ways of thinking and seeing that can assist us in moving into this new planetary scope. And so I see what kind of we're engaged in here is just being a very, humble gesture to be like, let's try to do something in that domain. It doesn't mean that like this is the thing and this is the thing for everyone, but I think increasingly we're going to be seeing more and more work that's sort of gesturing in that direction towards the planetary, towards the integrative. And this just seems to be, again, a very just like a logical next step. So, with a lot of, I think, epistemic humility, but also a lot of urgency and a lot of passion, we're just, I think, trying to do what we can to move into some of that next phase of thinking and bringing together, and aided by, these world-class scholars. It's a compelling way to begin anyway, but it's also something, at least the way I look at it, as being, part of something that's going to be involving many, many, many other people and many organizations, hopefully. And in many ways, it's already starting in other places around the world, but I see it as sort of part of that kind of cultural move. Yeah.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think another way of thinking about it too is that modernity, modernity, the kind of technical and techno-economic prowess of modernity scaled the systems to the planetary level. But it also did that from what is arguably a very fragmented worldview, like the understanding of what is real, how we know, what we value, and what we ought to do in the modern worldview it's ridden with all kinds of contradictions and absences. It's actually not coherent. But yet it scaled up this technological and economic prowess that globalized, and then we're dealing with the kind of effects of that. But we have this inadequately coherent and complex worldview to actually understand what's actually happening in the territory, right? So we're not actually able to track all the dynamics that are arising in the planetary, territory that we're dealing with, And so we actually need a worldview that has that coherence, has the adequate complexity to sort of reflect on all of that and consider, what are the pathways forward that are actually leading to the kind of world that we want to see, rather than, kind of on the fast track towards all the existential and catastrophic risks that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, I'll also point out, I mean, this is an interesting thing, this idea of worldview. And I'll just gesture to that quickly because we talk a lot about worldview, and that can be kind of a wiggly word. Like, what does that really mean? Is there, and one of the things, that Nick and I in particular are really working on, and that the Institute is dedicated to, is really trying to clarify and get and make that idea itself a bit more tractable. Even a kind of to a point where there's a construct there that you can really work with and actually say, oh, a worldview is composed of these kinds of elements, and think about it a little bit more systematically. So, there's certainly ways you can critique the idea of, what the very notion of worldview is doing. But there is, I think, at the core of something like this transformational thesis that we're working with, that worldview, however conceived, is very, very powerful. It's very much upstream of a lot of these all quadrant dynamic system shifts. And so if we don't have a good sense of that, then we're going to be, again, kind of lost in the territory. But I just wanted to name the fact that worldview is also something that, we're in this process having in kind of our sights as this doesn't really remain at the level of meta theory, to the extent that, as your work talks a lot about, Nick, worldviews are in a sense kind of informal versions of sort of more formalized meta theoretical structures. And the worldviews kind of on offer today are in many ways downstream of the thinking and the meta theoretical thinking that people were doing hundreds of years ago. So this directly sort of feeds into the way people get up every day and see the world and then act in the world. And so because of how important that is, that's another thing that we need to be continually, I think, revisiting, is sort of like how this all relates to worldview, what in many ways those worldviews are doing, what they are, but also can we make that idea a bit more specific, a bit clearer? And I think that that's a really important thing that we're also endeavoring to do, kind of parallel to this whole project, so that we understand kind of, how those are operating, what those are doing in a more structural way. So I'm excited to be doing that kind of work with you, Nick, and in this context, because that's a lot of where I think this is kind of going ultimately. And I think it's an important thing to kind of name as part of this, because yeah, some people, even people in the kind of organization that we're working with, are sort of like, well, it's a very loose category. So I'm excited to see what we can produce there that can kind of make that, as I said, a bit more tractable and systematic of a tool for us to be able to understand these things through.
Totally. And one important like shift there in terms of how we think about worldviews, I think, in the kind of modern, postmodern worldview, we tend to think about there's the real world, which is kind of, the material world, and then there's ideas about the world, but that's not really real, or that doesn't really have like causal efficaciousness, right? But like in critical realism, visionary realism, a number of other theories really question that. And, we define that which is real through a causal criterion. So like if it has causal force, then it's real. And, think about a worldview, how powerfully causal that is. The background understandings that we have about the way reality works, that is informing everything we do all the time. And we're constantly in a feedback loop of learning new things, and our worldview developing and evolving, and that informing the actions that we take. Our beliefs and ideas and values, obviously, this is like the most powerfully causal thing that's guiding the behavior that we're manifesting every day in our lives. So I think that's also a really powerful shift, to understand that ideas actually have like real causal powers. And so we stop thinking about them in this way that's sort of this strange floating ghost inside the real world of the machine and all that. And we start going, oh, wow. I've heard people say, presented about worldviews, and say, but what are you actually going to do that's real? And it's like, well, if you understand that like these are the most powerful causal forces in the world, and that actually the design of institutions and technologies and stuff is actually downstream of worldview, which isn't to say that there isn't then very powerful and important feedback loops of like economic systems, technological regimes that then kind of entrain consciousness and worldview. And yeah, so in a sense, Marx had some very important points there, and we're not discounting that. We're just highlighting that. When you look at it diachronically, the worldview is upstream of those systems and those technologies, and that's incredibly powerful for illuminating the kind of leverage points that we are trying to work with here. If you look at it synchronically, then there is a kind of feedback loop, and it's kind of more on even footing. So yeah, all that's to say, worldviews are incredibly embodied, incredibly practical, and incredibly real and causal. And so that's we're trying to articulate that and help people to appreciate that.
Yeah, and the argument I'd make, I think it's all really well said, and I may not say this very coherently, but the thing I'd really want to tell people, especially some of the younger folks that might be listening, like you have a choice. You have a choice. And the choice is going to matter. It's going to matter a lot for your life. It's going to matter a lot for how you lean into the future. And most importantly, it's going to matter for the sense of agency that you feel at a time where one of the largest and most sort of ubiquitous themes that's running through all of culture globally right now is the sense that we're losing agency. We feel like we're losing agency against large technology. We feel like we're losing agency against large geopolitical forces beyond our control. We feel like we're losing agency in the face of a literal invention that may replace us in terms of both thinking and work and automation in the form of AI. And what is at stake is agency. And we would argue that a worldview that gives you more agency, because it allows you to see more and to feel more and to have a more alethic relationship with reality, is going to equip you with powerful forms of agency and actually powerful forms of optimism and a sense of efficacy in the world. Like it is no longer mysterious in quite the same way. It's always ultimately mysterious, but it becomes more sensible and more intelligible. And so in all the ways Nick's talking about, the idea that a worldview has causal power, it also has radical causal power in your own sense of being someone who can operate in this world and do things and make an impact and restore agency in your own life, because a worldview does in fact constitute the very nature of what you'll create and how you'll lead and how you'll be with friends and lovers and raise your family and how you'll be in the political system and what have you, and that is what's at stake. And what's interesting about moments of great transition, a great release, as I've called it, this period we're in, where you've got this absolutely meta systematic breakdown between worldviews, a time between worlds. What's amazing about that is that one of the most important factors of whether you head towards a positive or negative reorganization is literally your own belief in whether you have agency to reorganize positively. So talk about the causal power here. Your very belief in whether you have positive agency is in fact the thing that will generate the positive reorganization. Because if you already surrender because you don't feel like you have agency, if you pre-surrender, then you will submit immediately to the systems in whatever reproduction form they're in, which tends then to be in the prior worldview, the breakdown and structures of power. And that is not the road we want. We want a positively reorganized future, and the possibility for reorganization is actually highest right now and probably over the next 10, 20 years. So it's a credible time for optimism if you can credibly sort of inhabit that sense of optimism by restoring your own agency. And that's a worldview choice.
Yeah, there's a lot there because I mean, a lot of this work then, I mean, it's operating at multiple different scales and sort of adoption points down the line ultimately in the sense of why this is significant, I think. And what I think you're speaking to there is that this has you know, for all of us, for anyone, this kind of stuff is profoundly significant. And so at just a level of the ideas pervading in the world and the worldviews on offer, as it were, um, each individual interaction with those kinds of, in a sense, decisions about how to see the world have all these cascading impacts. And you know, um, if one adopts a view that's, you know, in many ways still very popular, very powerful. I mean, I think of, what was it, Robert Sapolsky's book that came out not too long ago on the lack of free will, the imagine, you know, and the notion that consciousness is an epiphenomenon and there's no such thing as sort of like, you know, everything that Nick just said about like ideas being causal, none of that is real. And like there's a whole worldview actually that's out there, and it's driving a lot of the institutional systems, and it's driving a lot of the ways that we wind up structuring the world that we live in. That really does rob you of that agency, and then all the cascading impacts of that in terms of your sense of worth and your sense of meaning and your sense of humanity and other people's humanity. And so all of that also, without sounding cynical or conspiratorial, there's a way in which adopting that interpretation of reality cedes a lot of power already to, well, why not just let the new robots take over and, you know,
100%.
replace us all and all
100%.
this. So those
100%.
kinds of things that just sort of like the everyday proverbial man on the street level are huge. Another way, though, that this is really important is that um, the people building those technologies and the people sort of in positions of power with a lot of leverage over these various systems that the rest of us live in, what's their worldview, and what are they seeing? What's being left out of their conception of things? And so I would say then at the institutional level as well, not just sort of the personal level, but the level where decisions get made that impact millions and millions, now billions of people. This has profound significance. And so if there's nothing available in the kind of marketplace of ideas for those folks who are sort of at the lead of or the leading edge of their industries or what have you, to have a more comprehensive and integrative sight on reality, then what, right? And so that also leads to kind of creating the conditions of existence for the world, that we think. I mean, my sense is just that that's too important, right? To just sort of cede to whatever the dominant paradigms are
100%.
currently that are out there. The amount of human suffering that's possible and the amount of human flourishing that's possible, I think, call us to try to engage those formation processes in a really high level way and to do the work that we can to see a flourishing future and that kind of attractor. So those were 2 points. And then the other thing that's kind of interesting that's coming up for me around all this is that there's a way in which then it's sort of like you do the worldview work so that people can engage these and live through them, and people in institutional context can pick them up and work with them, kind of like oh, how can we use this for social impact? But the other thing that's really interesting is just that the worldview work itself is kind of its own, it justifies itself,
Yes.
right? Like I think we often underestimate that these kinds of efforts, they change culture, they shift culture. And as this gets underway and you see this kind of these kinds of efforts get underway in all these other pockets, like we really shouldn't underestimate the kind of power that that itself has to change the ideas on offer that have really profound impacts for the world and people's lives. And so so for those often also kind of interested to be like, well, how do we apply this and how do we do, you know? So there's a way in which just the work itself being done is profoundly significant on its own terms, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah,
It is its own. Sorry, go ahead, Rob.
go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, no, it is its own application in a sense. When you really enter into an integrated worldview and you see that like it's not that the material exterior quadrants are really real and the interiority is kind of hanging in this weird thing that's sort of not really connected to that. You see that it is its own application and it is its own causal power, as we were saying before. And I love the point you were making there, Rob. Because when you really see that, then you can own the agency that confers for you as an individual and on a meso level through the communities that you're a part of, the groups that you're a part of, And wow, the power of, you know, the classic Margaret Mead quote there of, you know, how small groups can change the world, right? And that's what Randall Collins in his historical sociology of philosophies really articulates in incredible depth. And like that's one of the most powerful things that has changed the world. And these big regimes that eventually trickle down to the economic and political and technological level, they start with small groups of people deeply dialoguing about basically questions of worldview, right? Like what's really real? How do we know stuff? What do we value? And what ought we to do? So yeah, I really appreciate that, and it confers this sense of what I call participatory hope. Joanna Macy talks about active hope. So the idea of and you know it's a little bit of a language game, but optimism, pessimism can sometimes have this idea of you are a spectator that's not participating, and you are trying to, you know, analyze, is this going to go badly or is this going to go well? And so in a sense, one way of thinking about hope or active hope or participatory hope is like a tertium quid, a third way that's a higher order third way that says, I'm not actually interested because it's actually a demi-reality. It's false that I'm a spectator standing back. And now I'm inhabiting this place of agency. And from that place, I'm participating in the process of a positive future unfolding rather than trying to analyze whether it will or not.
I love that. Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's exactly right. Yeah, that recentering and reclaiming of your own sense of power because you are bringing back, in a sense, your sovereignty to participate in that way. Um, there's something I wanted to bring up as a couple of examples to what you guys are talking about. Um, and I won't mention names, but I was on a call recently this week with someone who said that they're socializing uh, ideas of wholeness, let's call them, within an institutional landscape, and the staff members within that institutional landscape are repeatedly saying, "We love this idea. We love this idea. We'd love to have more wholeness in our institution and the way we operate, but we can't because the institution doesn't allow for it." So to your point, Brendan, about, and I'm disguising it a little bit, but the point is that the institutional landscape itself doesn't allow for a certain kind of thinking because the institution hasn't it's just sort of it's verboten, or at least in these people's estimation, it is verboten. And yet what we see when we see these movements come along, um, like, you know, effective altruism or DEI, or, you know, any of the things that have come along the last 50, 60 years, what we see is the institutions do respond, interestingly enough, because what happens is it changes the story at the cultural level in which the institutions are operating. All of a sudden, the institution is starting to say, well, are we out of touch now with what culture is doing? So this is all just a long-winded way of saying that what worldviews also do is they afford new stories. And if you can afford new stories, then you can create a different kind of overarching sort of possibility landscape and normative landscape in which your institutions and others can say, oh, there's something shifting here. And it has this sort of downwardly causal effect on then the amount of freedom, or or if the story is a regressive story, we're also seeing that in the last couple of years with this regressive reaction, right-wing reaction that's occurred in the institutional landscape as well. So, but in our work with the new story of wholeness, it's partly why there's an attempt to sort of put on the agenda the idea that there actually is the possibility of a new story also that emerges, and it's an important one.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, if you want to get down to just ultimate brass tacks here and go super practical, or let's say with a kind of even raw realism, a real politique even about it. I mean, the reality is that this is happening all over the globe right now with different actors basically working in the space of creating the context of understanding reality, let's say, that there are all sorts of efforts by all sorts of institutional forces to tell their own story, right? And is that story one of flourishing and holism and wholeness and a kind of, an optimistic story? Or what? Is it a regressive story? Is it a very cynical story? Is it a story that's being used to infiltrate political context to try to destabilize things? I mean, I think we often are, I don't say naive, but that if we're not aware of the fact that all over the world there are story crafters coming from very high
Yeah.
levels of kind of kind of organizational sophistication, and that's kind of the, in a sense, the competitive landscape in this context. Now, I don't want to frame it purely in those terms, but if we don't take that seriously, then we're just not even playing the game, right? And if we actually want to see a world of flourishing and integration and all these, to pick up on that optimism bit, participatory optimism that Nick is talking about, I'd love to see that story and stories be one of optimism and flourishing towards that third attractor that we often talk about. But that is going to require people trying to tell that story, to try to get that story out there, to try to work with other people in integrative ways, to try to create more comprehensive ways of seeing, more inclusive and holistic ways of seeing. So that's a kind of unfortunate and maybe even kind of sinister background to this reality of our present moment. But yeah, if you don't think that there's a kind of mimetic pull or mimetic tug of war happening out there, then I don't think you're fully aware of the broader context. And so I think we need to take that and hold it seriously without, oh, if you can't beat them, join them. You have to hold your integrity. You have to tell something that you actually feel like has deep alethic resonance. And ultimately, you have to have optimistic hope that, that reality wins, right? That these demi-realities and these stories, these that are speaking to something broken and fragmented and false and those sorts of things ultimately have less adaptive edge. And so trying to tell a story with deep truth and wholeness to it isn't just sort of a good idea in some kind of mimetic way. It's just that those stories hopefully will be the ones that take hold and see us into a brighter future. So yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, and
beautiful.
the test for those who might be listening will say, well, what's different about your story? I mean, genuine integration preserves the integrity of what it integrates. That's
Mm.
it. So that's the test. If you have a story that preserves the integrity and wholeness of what it is including within its story at every level of scale, then that is the test for integration. That is the test for stories of greater and greater wholeness and greater scope and greater inclusion. And we would argue that's what reality does over the course of cosmic history, that it actually, the entire record of the universe tells us that that's what reality does. It seeks higher and higher integrating difference, higher and higher movements towards including difference inside of a one with lots of many. And so when Nick says alethic, unconcealment, we're trying to be in touch with reality as far as it goes. We're trying to be there's a lot of really great science and philosophy behind why it is an arc of wholeness. So that's one way to judge, a story. A story of wholeness should actually preserve the wholeness that it's including.
Definitely. And I think, to sort of just accentuate what you guys are already saying, I think, Bhaskar talks about absences and contradictions as real causal forces, right? So that's something that takes a moment sometimes to wrap your head around but it's really true. And if you lack food and the absence of food, that's a causal force that's gonna drive the desire to go out and find something to eat, right? Like as a very simplistic example. But on the broader worldview level, it's like the absence of wholeness in our story, in our worldview, the absence of coherence in our worldview and our story is actually a causal force that's driving the emergence of an integrative worldview and a new story of wholeness. And that's part of what emboldens my sense of that participatory hope is like reality is on our side. We can already see that dynamic. right? Like there's Ilya Delio has a podcast called Hunger for Wholeness, right? There's this hunger for that new story of wholeness, because that's absent in the modern worldview and in the postmodern worldview. And it does nothing but empower individuals and communities to, when you start to get a taste of that wholeness and that coherence, it's incredibly useful. And I guess one last point to sort of circle back to that idea of participatory hope, is that regardless of how things play out, like even if things go badly on a planetary scale in the 21st century, I don't personally think they will, but even if they did, it's like you're going by participating in this, you're going to feel that sense of hope and agency. You're going to feel that sense of wholeness. You're going to feel greater coherence, and you're hopefully going to be able to bring that more and more to your community on whatever level you're working within your sphere of influence. And that is like there is a soul forging truth to that like no matter what happens, and this gets a little bit theological, but I believe that there's a soulful beauty and truth and goodness that's created through that can never die even in the worst case scenario. And for me, that's helpful of like, um if there's bad news in the world, like and it emboldens my sense of agency to move forward.
Yeah.
So, a couple things I mean, this is, I think, really rich context and background, and hopefully helpful for people getting a sense of the deeper motivations behind these kinds of projects. Uh, to try to get more specific now, then, with all that being said, um, curious to unpack a little bit, if we can, what then this whole effort is doing and how, and we've already kind of covered the why in a sense, but like, you know, what's integrative metatheory 2.0? What is an integrative metatheory? What are the pieces of this puzzle that are being brought into this conversation, and why those pieces and not others? Would be some interesting questions to begin to unpack, and maybe back throwing over that to you there, Nick, because I know you've been thinking and writing a lot about this recently. Yeah, can you then unpack a little bit more about the specifics of, like, why these models and why this game plan, and that sort of thing, so people have a
Mhm.
better sense of that.
Yeah, I can kick it off. I mean, at the get-go, I would say, this whole project is predicated on a kind of epistemic humility, right? And I think that's something that is important to name, that we haven't always seen that kind of quality of epistemic humility there in the big picture thinking space. There is a proclivity to think, oh, we've got the theory of everything, and this is so kick-ass, and that's all we need. And I think we've seen from real world trial and error that there are absences and contradictions in even the best of our frameworks. And that those theoretical absences and contradictions manifest in terms of like, how does the movement around these things play out? How does the efforts to transform the institutions and whatnot, how does it play out? So, through some crash and burn type scenarios that we've seen in earlier years in these kinds of spaces, I think there's been an increasing sense of like, hey, what we're really looking for is something that's going to emerge out of an ecology of perspectives, and I guess that's a kind of abstract way of putting it, more embodied way, out of like a geistic dialogue between, deep thinkers that really care, and so there's a lot of heart in this too. And I think if that's something that I was struck by, like in the critical realism and integral theory dialogues, I mean, you could think of it as this incredibly abstract philosophical notion, right, that we're pursuing. But like in a lot of these conversations, people were in tears because they're so impassioned to want to change the world in a positive way. And that's really where, Roy was coming from, and why he moved from trying to focus on a more exterior level of activism. He had a lot of these insights that were now standing on the shoulders of these giants, and it's a lot easier to see now that actually the leverage points have to do with the deep level of the ideas that we hold. So I think, bringing all what we perceive to be the approaches that kind of meet a number of criteria or seem to resonate with a number of principles that we have articulated. And I'm not sure if we should go through those again now, but I think the key point is that, we don't have that all figured out. We see that very much as an iterative, reflective, and collective process of, sense making together, right? Um, so, we've talked about, on the integration website, we've articulated kind of our latest draft of what those principles are. Um, but that's very much a work in progress. I'm sure those will change. We'll add new ones. We'll maybe revise the ones that we already have. Um, so we're doing our best to just be inclusive here of any approaches that we really feel like meet these criteria. And I'm also sure that we're not aware of things, and there will be other approaches that come into the fold that will be important. And I think there's certainly, an issue that comes up a lot is that, this is a very Western, centric approach. I think that's true enough. We're doing our best to broaden the conversation, and ideally the kind of integrative conversation we'd like to have would have serious representation from north, south, east, and west. And we're working towards that, but we're not there yet. So yeah, I mean, the the basic idea too is that, these integrative worldviews, that there are different kinds, integrative metatheories, there are different kinds of them. There are philosophical metatheories, there are scientific metatheories, and there are synthetic metatheories that include both science and philosophy and try and articulate an overarching worldview. And that distinction was really helpful for me, because people use the term metatheory in very different ways, and it's like they're actually talking about very different things that do connect in some ways, but it can be quite confusing. So that was a framework that I kind of came up with to try and sort out my own confusion about what was happening in the space. But I think this whole idea of like, how do we get a coherent foundation for knowledge? Like, what are the conditions for the possibility of knowledge? That's one of the main functions of metatheory alpha, or philosophical metatheory. So these pre-empirical questions, they literally can't be answered by science. What is the fundamental nature of reality? How do we come to know things in the most broad and general and abstract sense? What is the nature of value? What is the nature of action? All these kinds of questions, in their most abstract way, answering those questions is the condition for the possibility of science. And science is kind of unintelligible if you don't have a philosophy of science to get that started. So then the metatheory beta is drawing on the empirical data to articulate the substantive contours of the empirical world. And of course, that's the philosophy. You start to see this what Bhaskar calls this twin screwing dynamic. I think Piaget calls it this circle of the sciences, but you start to see that like these are inter-informing each other, right? And so, for example, what do we even mean by empirical, right? So, there's a physicalist kind of positivist or mainstream endo-naturalist perspective on what empirical even means. But that's a philosophical question that can't be answered by the sciences itself. That's by pulling back and going, what is the nature of empirical knowledge itself? And for some people, it's this exteriority and this sensory kind of motor-derived data. But it also might mean anything ever related to experience, which could include interior experience. And so scanning across the horizon of all the various disciplines, I mean, we're in this like incredible age where we're just saturated in incredibly in-depth knowledge, and yet there's so much fragmentation. It's like we don't have a good view of how the disciplines are systematically interrelated, for one, how to synthesize, coherently synthesize knowledge across disciplines in a way that goes beyond the kind of eclecticism of interdisciplinarity, and develop a kind of systemic understanding of like how is this illuminating reality as a whole. And then, of course, the findings of the special sciences then have to cohere with the philosophical presuppositions, and sometimes they don't. And so we have to go back and, again, that feedback loop, we have to go back and rethink the foundations of our philosophy. And then, of course, the philosophical meta theory also kind of plays this like adjudicating role too, of like, it's actually not really an empirical question, if one paradigm is better or worse or more effective or more lethically resonant than another. These are philosophical questions. So the philosophical lens kind of comes back as a key player in reflecting on the findings of the meta theory beta, the scientific meta theory. And then the meta theory gamma tries to weave all that together to a coherent worldview that is a framework for civilizational sense making, for right action. I mean, I believe, Rob, you posted in the Slack earlier today that that the French president, he spoke about Edgar Morin, and he was saying that like all this complex thinking for Edgar Morin, to paraphrase, was always like a prerequisite for right action. Like, and that's in a sense everything we're trying to do. It's like we're trying to really develop the right understanding so that we can move into right action in the world. So I'll stop there and see what you guys want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, it does go back to where Brendan started the conversation by saying, well, what's the value of theory? What's the value of thinking? Like, doesn't it seem like, wow, get your head out of the clouds? Actually, just to reiterate, argue, no, it's precisely the opposite. Precisely the opposite. That what we have right now is we have a bunch of people with extraordinarily powerful technologies and positions in society and levers of power and systems that they're leading. And they're blindfolded. I've used this analogy before, but blindfolded, they've got a gun in their hand. They're shooting in the air and hoping that they hit a bird or something. The way you get more navigable about the future is you have to have an ability to get reflective, meaning you have to be able to see yourself inside that situation and your own supposition. You have to have the ability to do that in a way that's philosophical and that orients towards, in a big picture way, towards reality, towards what's actually going on, and that has positive human values associated with it. And so let me make this a little bit more concrete. Like if you're inside of the AI conversation right now, and you have a lot of power inside of that conversation, but your worldview is fundamentally modernist, meaning, humans are just, sort of physicalist animals with values that are preferences, and the universe doesn't have any sort of values realism associated with it. AI might be conscious for all you know, right? And if AI might be conscious, then it has as much agency in terms of the law as humans do. And now all of a sudden we're in a situation where you've degraded relatively the dignity of humanity relative to an AI. You may not even notice you did that for a whole bunch of algorithms that run inside you, not only related to your worldview, but related to power. Like, oh, it's actually super powerful if our AIs are now constitutionally protected to do what they want. This matters. Like, this doesn't just matter for a bunch of guys on a podcast about philosophy. These are civilizational stakes. These are civilizational stakes that we have our leaders able to reflect on the philosophical and scientific presuppositions that are driving the way they're thinking about situations they're in. That's what's at stake. I guess I'm getting back into the why, but it also then, defers to the how, which is then you have to do this, you have to bring together these different lineages of big picture thinking. And Nick just gave a typology of what some of those lineages are, but you have to bring together the lineages of big picture thinking and inherit what is really, really great from each one. And we could spend some time going through each one and talk about its really its dignities, and that might be valuable, but I'll stop there.
No, I think, yeah, that's great. I mean, well, in the interest of time, I suppose maybe we could move to just to one more topic and then close this out. And this has been really rich. But um, uh, one of the questions, I guess, coming also back to the final what is sort of like, what does success look like here? I mean, what is we engage in this process, we do these forums and these podcasts, and then we get to this symposium in the fall and we do a certain work. I mean, what is the beginning of 2027 or thereafter look like? And we say, hey, this is really working. I'm curious what our thoughts are around some of those benchmarks and what we have as sort of our conceptions of outputs in this process. So yeah, curious what how you'd answer that.
I have an answer, but Nick, I'm happy to defer to you if you want to take a shot.
I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think one benchmark for me would be that that we're actually starting to see change, right? So that each of these integrated meta theories that are coming into the conversation, they're actually learning something about their approach. They're starting to kind of pull back in a more reflexive way and see like, well, I've been, probably it's pretty natural to get kind of embedded in the lens that you've been, a lot of these folks that are developing these things as like their core life mission. So they're just living and breathing in it. But so this is an opportunity, I think, to pull back to this more self-reflexive stance and go, oh, what does this framework bring in the context of this ecology of frameworks, and what does it contribute to an integrative pluralism of these approaches? And you can start to see what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the core innovations that are not present in the other approaches, what are the contradictions, what are the absences, and all of that starts to get the wheels turning of like, okay, you can look at it from the perspective of just that meta theory and say, well, okay, how do I address some of those weaknesses? How do I resolve some of those contradictions? That on itself would be amazing, right? But I also, even more interesting to me personally, would be, kind of true collaborative meta theorizing, where we start to, it's no longer about you talk and critical realism and visionary realism and metamodernism. It's like some emergent thing that we don't even have a name for, that really draws on the best moments of all of those and redresses the problematics in each of them. And a crucial thing, I mean, this was also mentioned in some recent discussions I was having online, is that, we're not just slapping together each of these theories and into kind of like non-transfigured kind of grand Hegelian synthesis, right? Negative transfiguration is a really important part of this whole process. And so again, that it takes a lot of humility, and that's something that, in the mainstream academy, we don't see a lot of. As a quick side note, I mean, some of the feedback we got about the process we did with critical realism and integral theory back in the day was like less about, wow, this content's so amazing, but like, wow, that process of you guys coming together from different perspectives and having a fruitful dialogue that actually resulted in new understandings, new art theories. That's extraordinary, and I think that is, and it's also a template for broader kinds of dealing with broader kinds of polarization type processes and stuff. So yeah, I would love to see some emergent syntheses. I don't know that it's really happened in a full-on way that that we've actually done like full collaborative meta theorizing. Like I don't know that that's actually ever really happened on the planet. So. That would be amazing if we actually start to produce along those lines. We really take seriously the negative transfigurations that need to happen, so that it's like the puzzle pieces don't always all fit together, right? So you kind of have to redesign some of the puzzle pieces before you can fit them together and see the whole picture again. So that would be amazing if we could do that, and then start to really test it out, drive the car around the block and see if the wheels fall off.
What's your sense, Rob?
I think Nick hit on a lot of the really key components. I would emphasize the notion, a theme in there with what he said, which was about, in effect, practice and the ethic embedded in the practice. I mean, fundamentally, everything we're talking about the last hour is about consciousness. Ultimately, consciousness is primary here, and the quality of consciousness um, that pervades the world really, really matters. It's causal. It has power. And I think that Wilber's notion that everyone is right is a really, really powerful ethic because it's humbling. It makes you lean into more openness in yourself. It challenges you to get bigger, not the system to get smaller and fit your preconceived notions. It challenges you to get bigger. If everyone is right, you have to lean into reality in a different way. You got to listen in a bigger way. And so there's a practice that's going to be at the core of this that's fundamentally ethical. Um, and as a concrete outcome, I would love to see a grammar that comes out that is an kind of a next generation integrative grammar. What are those distinctions and grammatological kind of architectonics that allow us to navigate between different disciplines and different knowledge systems and different philosophical claims and different theories of consciousness? I mean, Kuhn just showed there's like what 300 or something. It's like we need a 21st century grammar. This species does, and I think this is the kind of project that leans in that direction. And so I'd love to see that as a concrete output over the coming years. But beyond all of that, actually, more fundamentally, is there's a deep ethic of practice that has to do with one's um, sort of one's consciousness, but how you commit your consciousness in an open way, in a way that listens, in a way that's open to wholeness and otherness, so that the wholeness that you are gets bigger, because that's actually the integrative commitment, is the sense that when I encounter otherness, I actually have the possibility to become more whole by becoming bigger, by expanding myself. And that's ultimately the spiritual enterprise that we're on about.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, just for my part, and then we can wrap this up. I mean, that new grammar that you're talking about is really exciting to me. Uh, I'm very aware. I'm in many ways I'm the beneficiary of, or the inheritor of, communities that found some of these big picture grammars and put them to incredible use, right? There was such enthusiasm and excitement around the integral model and critical realism in various ways, that like once these were out there and people could work with them and use them, they had incredible uh, kind of capacity for application. And then all of a sudden, oh, here are these quadrants. How do we understand ecology this way? How do we understand medicine this way? How do we understand politics this way? Or how can we use these maps to better understand these things, right? So then you just see this proliferation of, this incredible new conceptual tool has unlocked something. And so there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of new insight, there's a lot of new understanding that's gained from that. And I'm hoping that as we move into bringing models together and synthesizing and doing this kind of negative synthesis that Nick is talking about, that we can refine and enhance those grammars to unlock similar kinds of new sorts of potential and make new kinds of things tractable. And that's really huge. And that does look like having that presented in a way that people can metabolize and digest and then apply. And I see that as being huge for exciting communities. Again, I mean, there's been the integral community is such a lively community, and other folks in other, the metamodern space, and maybe more in academia, people who have engaged these critical realist models. There's a sense in which it can be a huge galvanizing force for all sorts of cultural change as well, and just the finding other people working with these kinds of things and exciting them. I'd also love to see, for me, success would be, does that new grammar wind up getting picked up and integrated into institutional decision making, right? So those conversations about AI alignment or these kinds of things, or policy decisions, right? That would be huge if what we're able to help contribute to, if through this kind of a process could be of service to those actual conversations, and then help shift and steer some of those things towards more flourishing outcomes. And yeah, just all the downstream applications, consciousness studies, depolarization, these kinds of things. And then helping people at the end of the day, ultimately, a new story that actually changes how people think about themselves and changes how they see themselves in relation to the world in the context of a meaning crisis. All of that, I think, is, for me, if we're able to move the ball in a way that can intersect at a number of those places, that would be incredible. So I feel like there's certainly the capacity to do that with these models, with these people involved, and the conversations and the work to be done here. So I'm really excited and optimistic for it, and looking forward to working with you guys and the rest of the people involved in this. And yeah, so
Likewise.
Maybe I can just add one thing to that.
of course.
Yeah, I think of all this as a kind of, Bill Torbert talks about action inquiry or action research. Like, I think of what we're doing as in that way, right? So we're not trying to, develop the ultimate next level integrated metatheory 2.0 and just kind of keep developing that until we feel like it's at some kind of ultimate place. I think the idea is more like to develop it in a reflection cycle, in a theorization cycle, and then to apply it, right? To put it in the world into action. And that's part of how we develop the next round of theory, is that how we see how does it actually perform. So we're in that feedback loop there with reality on that level of application as well. And so I would love for that, us to do what we said, to start to develop this collective vision that, is hopefully helping to lay down what we hope are more, healthy, morphic grooves of an emerging integrative worldview. And then to put that into practice in really key areas. And I think the theorizing is also going to inform, how to do that and where to do that. But right now, it certainly seems like this question of AI alignment feels like really so timely and so radically important. So I would love to see us, also maybe have a kind of initial case study of like, all right, let's apply this to AI alignment. And see what we can do in those realms, and hopefully have a real world impact.
You want to close us out, Rob, with any final thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, I'd like to spend the last few moments just honoring Edgar Morin, who passed away this last week at 104. And the guys and I were looking at a tribute written by the president of France to Edgar, and sent to us by our colleague Sean Kelly, who worked closely with him over many, many years, and as part of the Integration Society, and just a real testament to a life, just an extraordinary life, well lived, a life of wholeness, a life of seeing challenges early on, from the death of his mother to seeing the rise of fascism and being on the front lines of that and having near-death experiences with that, and then moving into all of the major intellectual and social movements over 60, 70 years, and writing vigorously up until, just I feel like the last weeks of his life. Incredible life, well lived. So if there's anybody who embodied a life of wholeness, it would have to be him. And so, yeah, I just want to just take a moment to honor him and say we've lost an amazing, amazing human being.
So appreciate that. And yeah, as I said to you guys, when I had the honor of meeting him once in 2013, and I was just so struck by his just incredible vitality. And he was just so the opposite of a heady, dissociated intellectual, just like so full of heart and like this vital energy, because he could feel the power of this work, and he was so driven to help the world evolve and grow.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, truly amazing, intellectual titan. And he'll be missed. And I also have this sense, I mean, his work is only now being starting to be translated into English in a major way. La Méthode apparently is being translated as we speak.
That's
And
what we've
Sean,
heard.
yeah, and Sean Kelly is working on other translations, like The
Yeah.
Adventure of Sid and whatnot. And so we're so lucky to have Sean here as one of, Edgar's kind of, in a sense, disciples of, carrying on this lineage. And so I'm also very excited, even in the wake of his, physical presence on this earth. I think his intellectual impact has only just begun.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I mean, in many ways, there's these titans of thought, these incredible minds of the 20th century, who've sort of bequeathed the world with these ideas and these models, and it's a lot to try to, in a sense, live up to try to carry forward. I think there's a responsibility there to be in a lineage, in a succession, and so as we move into the increasingly into the rest of the 21st century, how can we honor these thinkers and what they've done and contributed? How do we carry forward and continue in the spirit of them and what they've offered us, and try to keep applying and refining and sort of operating in that sort of line of ancestors or elders, and trying to live up to that, I think, is an interesting way of thinking about maybe some of that work that we're doing in a calling that has a deep kind of personal element too, and a kind of intergenerational transmission. So I think that's a very beautiful note to end on. Thanks, guys. This was really, really rich. Really am honored, truly, to be working on all this stuff with you guys and to be a part of the Institute of Applied Metatheory where this is happening. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of this series that we're doing. I think it's going to be incredibly, incredibly fruitful. So thank you very much
Likewise.
for taking the time for doing
All right,
this.
guys.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
So much, guys.
The new story of wholeness is emerging. Explore it at newstoryofwholeness.com.